My name is Eleanor Hartwell. I'm 67 years old, and I learned something profound at my husband's funeral that I wish I'd understood decades earlier. Silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. And sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is smile while everyone else celebrates too soon. The chapel was suffocating that morning, not from grief, though God knows there was plenty of that, but from the thick, cloying atmosphere of greed masquerading as mourning. My husband Richard had been gone for 3 days. 3 days since the heart attack took him in our library, his reading glasses still perched on his nose, a biography of Churchill open on his lap. 3 days since I'd held his cooling hand and whispered promises I intended to keep. But the funeral wasn't about Richard. Not really. Not to them. I sat in the front pew, my black dress simple and elegant, my hands folded in my lap. Around me swirled a performance I'd been watching for 15 years, ever since Richard and I married. His children, my stepchildren, though I'd long since stopped thinking of them with any familial warmth, had arrived early, dressed in designer mourning clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Vanessa, Richard's daughter, was 38 and possessed the kind of beauty that came from expensive maintenance rather than genetics. Everything about her was carefully curated: the honey blonde highlights, the subtle Botox, the personal trainer body wrapped in Chanel. She dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief, performing grief for the relatives who'd traveled from out of state. Her brother Marcus, 41, stood beside her in a bespoke suit, his arm around his wife, Petra. Marcus had inherited his father's height, but none of his character. Where Richard had been thoughtful and kind, Marcus was calculating and cold. He'd spent his adult life coasting on his father's name, taking executive positions at companies where Richard sat on the board, failing upward with a safety net made of family money. And then there was Trevor, the youngest at 35. Trevor had the artistic temperament, Richard used to say, which was a polite way of describing someone who'd never held a job for more than 6 months and treated his father's wealth as an unlimited ATM. He stood slightly apart from his siblings, his black shirt wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. Whether from grief or last night's substances, I couldn't say. Didn't care, really. They'd been circling Richard for months, ever since his first heart scare. Suddenly, adult children who'd barely called became deeply concerned, visiting every weekend, asking pointed questions about estate planning and investments. Richard saw through it, of course. My husband was many things, but fool wasn't one of them. The service began. Pastor Mitchell spoke beautiful words about Richard's life, his 40 years building Hartwell Industries from a small manufacturing firm into a regional powerhouse, his philanthropy, his love of literature and classical music, his sharp wit. The words painted a picture of the man I'd loved, the man I'd spent 15 years building a life with, the man whose memory these vultures were already dividing up like carrion. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't devastated. I was. Richard had been my partner, my intellectual equal, my unexpected joy after a first marriage that had ended in quiet disappointment decades ago. But I'd done my crying in private, in the night since he'd died, in the empty bed that still smelled like his cologne. Here, in front of them, I maintained the composure Richard had always admired. Eleanor always had steel in her spine, he used to say. They mistake stillness for weakness. It's their first mistake, usually their last. The service ended. People filed past the casket, murmuring condolences that ranged from sincere to perfunctory. I accepted them all with the same gracious nod, the same soft, "Thank you for coming," the same dignified restraint. And then Harrison Webb stood up. Harrison was Richard's attorney, a silver-haired man in his 60s who'd handled the Hartwell family legal affairs for 30 years. He'd been sitting toward the back, and now he moved to the front of the chapel with the kind of grave formality that made everyone stop their milling about and turn to watch. "If I might have everyone's attention," he said, his voice carrying that courtroom authority that made people listen. "I apologize for the unusual timing, but the Hartwell family has requested that we address the matter of Richard's estate immediately following the service. Given the circumstances and the family's wishes, I've agreed to read the relevant portions of his last will and testament now, while everyone is gathered." The room went silent. I felt, rather than saw, the sudden alertness from Vanessa, Marcus, and Trevor. They moved closer, forming a small cluster near the front. Petra joined them, her hand clutching Marcus's arm. Vanessa's husband Derek appeared from somewhere in the back, looking uncomfortable but interested. Harrison pulled a document from his leather portfolio. It was thick, official-looking, bound with a blue backing. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "I, Richard Jonathan Hartwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, executed on March 15th of this year." March 15th. I knew that date. Richard had been in the hospital then, recovering from the first heart attack, the warning shot his body had fired to let him know time was running short. Harrison had come to his private room with documents. I'd been there, holding Richard's hand, but Richard had asked me to step out for a few minutes. "Some business matters, darling," he'd said. "Boring legal language. Why don't you get some coffee?" I'd gone, trusting him as I always had. I hadn't thought much about it since. Harrison continued reading, his voice steady and clear. "To my children, Vanessa Claire Hartwell Morrison, Marcus Jonathan Hartwell, and Trevor Richard Hartwell, I leave my entire estate, including all properties, financial holdings, business interests, and personal effects, to be divided equally among the three of them." The words hung in the air like poisonous gas. Around me, I felt the shift in atmosphere. Vanessa's sharp intake of breath, Marcus's sudden rigidity, Trevor's surprised laugh, quickly stifled. Harrison kept reading, detailing the specifics. The house, this beautiful Georgian mansion that Richard and I had restored together, where we'd spent countless evenings in the library, where we'd hosted dinner parties and charity events, where every room held memories of our life together. The vacation home in Cape Cod, where we'd spent summers walking the beach at dawn. The investment portfolio worth millions, the controlling shares in Hartwell Industries, the art collection, the vehicles, everything, to them. "As for my wife, Eleanor Margaret Hartwell," Harrison read, and I forced myself to remain absolutely still. "I trust that my children will ensure she is cared for with the dignity and respect she deserves." That was it. No specific provisions, no trust fund, no property in my name. Just a vague hope that the people who'd treated me like an interloper for 15 years would suddenly develop compassion and generosity. Harrison folded the document carefully and looked around the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The will is properly executed, witnessed, and filed with the court. There are additional administrative details to be handled, of course, but this represents the substantive distribution of the estate. My condolences again to the family during this difficult time." For a moment, absolute silence held the chapel. Then Vanessa made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and turned to embrace Marcus. Marcus pulled her close, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes bright with something that looked uncomfortably like triumph. Trevor stood frozen for a heartbeat, then a grin split his face, wide and genuine and utterly inappropriate. They hugged each other. Right there, 5 feet from Richard's casket, they held each other in an embrace that had nothing to do with shared grief and everything to do with shared windfall. "Oh my God," Vanessa whispered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Oh my God, Marcus. The house, the business, everything." "Dad really did it," Trevor said, his voice wonderstruck. "He actually left it all to us, not—" He cut himself off, glancing at me, but the end of that sentence hung obvious in the air. Not to her. Petra, Marcus's wife, didn't even pretend discretion. "The Cape House," she breathed. "I've always loved that house. We can spend whole summers there now. The kids will—" "Later," Marcus cut her off, but he was smiling. Smiling at his father's funeral, 3 feet from his father's body. Vanessa turned to me then, and I watched her rearrange her face into an expression of sympathy so false it was almost artistic. She approached, her heels clicking on the marble floor, and reached out to take my hand. Her skin was cold, her grip brief and limp. "Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with synthetic concern, You poor thing. This must be such a shock." Poor thing. The words crystallized something in my chest, something that had been forming for 15 years, but had never quite solidified until this moment. "I'm sure we can work something out," Marcus added, joining his sister. His tone suggested he was doing me an enormous favor. "Dad wanted you taken care of. We'll make sure you have something. A small allowance, maybe. We're not heartless." "There's that guest cottage on the property," Trevor suggested, his grin never quite fading. "Eleanor could stay there. It's small, but it's nice. Better than, having to move to some apartment somewhere." The guest cottage, a converted carriage house we'd used for overflow guests during parties. 700 square feet with a kitchenette and a fold-out sofa. They were already planning my diminishment, parceling out their generosity like breadcrumbs, and Richard wasn't even in the ground yet. People were staring now. Some looked sympathetic. Friends of Richard's who knew our marriage had been genuine, who'd seen the love between us. Others looked scandalized. A few looked grimly satisfied, as if they'd always suspected I was just a gold digger who'd gotten her comeuppance. I sat there, my hands still folded in my lap, and I did something that surprised everyone. I smiled. Not a big smile, not manic or inappropriate, just a small, quiet curve of my lips that held secrets they couldn't begin to imagine. "That's very kind of you," I said softly, my voice perfectly even. "Very kind indeed." Vanessa blinked, clearly expecting tears, or protest, or anger. My calm seemed to unsettle her more than hysterics would have. She glanced at Marcus, who frowned slightly. "Well," Vanessa said, recovering, "we should probably start thinking about the arrangements. The estate, I mean. Harrison, when can we begin the probate process? How quickly can we access—" "Mrs. Hartwell," Harrison interrupted, and something in his tone made everyone stop. He was looking directly at me, and unless I was very mistaken, there was the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. "If I might speak with you privately for a moment." "Of course," I said, rising gracefully. My knees protested. I was 67, not 27, but I'd learned long ago to move through discomfort without showing it. We walked toward the back of the chapel, Harrison's hand lightly guiding my elbow. Behind us, I heard the immediate explosion of whispered conversation. Vanessa's voice, sharp and questioning. Marcus, lower and annoyed. Trevor laughing again, the sound echoing inappropriately off the vaulted ceiling. Harrison led me to a small side room, the one the funeral home used for families needing privacy. He closed the door, muffling the chaos outside, and turned to face me with an expression that was almost gentle. "Mrs. Hartwell," he began, but I raised my hand to stop him. "I know," I said simply. His eyebrows rose. "You know?" "That what you read wasn't the real will. Yes, I know." The surprise on his face was almost comical. "Richard told you?" "Richard told me everything, Harrison. We had 15 years together. We built a life. Did you really think he'd discuss business, finances, legacy, and then somehow never mention what would happen to it all when he died? But you sat there and let them show exactly who they are," I finished. "One more time. One final, definitive time with witnesses." Understanding dawned across Harrison's features, followed by something that looked remarkably like respect. "He said you'd want to do it this way. I argued with him, told him it was cruel to put you through that scene. He said you'd insist on it." He knew me well. Harrison reached into his portfolio and pulled out another document. This one was thinner, but the paper was the same official weight, the same legal appearance. "This is Richard's actual last will and testament, executed 6 months ago when he was in perfect health, witnessed by 3 separate parties including myself, and filed with probate court on the same day. It supersedes any subsequent documents by virtue of a clause Richard had inserted into his estate plan 15 years ago when you married." I took the document, though I didn't need to read it. Richard and I had discussed every word, had made these decisions together, in the library, over glasses of wine, with honest conversations about love, family, and the complicated legacy of wealth. The will I read in there," Harrison continued, "was real enough. Richard did execute it in March during the hospital stay, but it was never valid. Couldn't be. The override clause in the original estate plan specified that any modifications to the will had to be approved by you as well as Richard. That hospital will has your signature nowhere on it. Therefore, it's legally void. The original will stands." "They don't know that yet." "No," Harrison agreed, "though they will very soon. The reading I just did was, let's call it a dramatic interpretation of Richard's wishes. He asked me to do it, actually, insisted on it, in one of our last conversations. He said he wanted you to see them, one final time, without their masks. And he wanted them to reveal themselves publicly, so there could be no question, no doubt about who they truly were." I thought about Richard in those final weeks, weak but still sharp, still thinking 3 moves ahead like the chess player he'd been, planning this moment, this revelation with the precision of a master strategist. "He loved them," I said softly, "despite everything. They were his children." "He did," Harrison agreed, "but he loved you more. And he loved what you built together. He wasn't about to let them destroy it." I looked at the document in my hands, at Richard's bold signature across the bottom, and felt the weight of his trust, his confidence, his belief that I would be strong enough to handle this. All of this. "How long do we have before they find out?" Harrison checked his watch. "Probate hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Judge Blackwood is handling it personally. He and Richard played golf together for 20 years. The real will is already filed. I'll submit the motion to invalidate the hospital document first thing in the morning. By 10 a.m. tomorrow, they'll know the truth." "One day," I said. "They get 1 day to believe they've won." Richard thought it appropriate. "Let them celebrate," he said. "Let them plan. Let them show their gratitude for his generosity by immediately calculating how to minimize their obligations to his widow, and then let them learn." We stood in silence for a moment, 2 people who'd both loved Richard Hartwell in different ways, honoring his final chess move. "You should go home," Harrison said gently. "This part is over. Let them have their party. Tomorrow, reality arrives." "Tomorrow," I agreed. He opened the door and we stepped back into the chapel. The crowd had thinned, people drifting toward the reception hall where coffee and sandwiches were being served. But Vanessa, Marcus, and Trevor remained, clustered together near the casket, their phones already out, no doubt texting friends or calling financial advisors. They looked up as I approached. Vanessa's expression shifted to that false sympathy again. "Eleanor, are you all right? We were worried. You left so suddenly." "I'm fine," I assured her. "Harrison just wanted to discuss some paperwork, administrative details. Nothing important." "Well, if you need anything," Marcus said magnanimously, "anything at all, you just let us know. We're family, after all." Family. The word felt obscene in his mouth. "Thank you," I said. "That's very generous." Trevor was typing on his phone, barely paying attention. "Hey, Marcus, should we call Dad's broker today or wait until after the weekend? I want to know exactly what we're working with." "Trevor," Vanessa hissed, "not now." "What?" "I'm just saying, the sooner we get organized, the better. We've got properties to manage, a business to run." "A business you've never worked at," I said quietly. The 3 of them turned to stare at me. It was the first real comment I'd made, the first crack in my serene facade. "I'm sorry?" Marcus said, his tone cooling. "Hartwell Industries," I continued, my voice still soft but clear. "Trevor, you've never worked there. Neither have you, Vanessa. Marcus, you lasted 3 months before your father moved you to a do-nothing consulting position because you couldn't manage the actual work." "I don't think," Marcus began, his face reddening. "I'm not criticizing," I interrupted gently, "just observing. It's a complex business. Manufacturing, supply chains, labor relations. It takes specific skills. I'm sure you'll hire competent people to actually run it." The temperature in the space between us dropped about 20 degrees. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "We're Hartwells," she said coldly. "It's our family business." "Of course," I agreed. I just hope you take care of it. Your father spent 40 years building it. It would be a shame to see it dismantled for quick cash." "Are you suggesting we'd—" Marcus started, but I was already turning away. "If you'll excuse me," I said. "It's been a very long day. I think I'll head home." "Home," Trevor repeated, and there was an edge to it now. "Yeah, about that. We should probably talk about timeline, Eleanor. For moving. I know Dad said we should take care of you, and we will, but the house is technically ours now, and we'll need to make some decisions about—" "The house can wait," Vanessa cut him off, shooting her brother a warning look. "Let's just get through today first." But the poison was already in the air, the pretense wearing thin. They wanted me gone. Wanted me out of the house, out of the money, out of the story of Richard Hartwell entirely, so they could inherit not just his wealth, but his legacy, rewriting history to erase the 15 years he'd spent happier with me than he'd ever been in his first marriage to their mother. I left them there, in the chapel with their father's body and their shiny new greed, and walked out into the autumn afternoon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Richard had loved this time of day. We used to sit on the back terrace with glasses of wine, watching the light change, talking about everything and nothing. I would miss him forever, but I wouldn't let them destroy what we'd built. Harrison found me by my car, a tasteful gray Mercedes that Richard had given me 3 years ago for my birthday. "He's being moved to the cemetery now. The burial is private. Just you, per Richard's instructions." "Thank you." I paused, my hand on the car door. "Harrison, when they find out tomorrow, what should I expect?" He considered the question carefully. "Rage, disbelief, legal threats? Probably, though they won't have a leg to stand on. Richard's estate plan is airtight. I saw to that personally. Will they fight it? They might try. But Eleanor, I've been doing this for 35 years. I've never seen a more meticulously constructed will. Every I dotted, every T crossed, every possible challenge anticipated and blocked. Richard wanted to be absolutely certain they couldn't undo his decisions. Because he knew them, I said softly. Knew exactly how they'd react. He did, and he structured everything accordingly. I got into the car and drove home through streets I'd navigated for 15 years, past the park where Richard and I used to walk on Sunday mornings, past the bookstore where we'd spent hours browsing, past the small Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated anniversaries. The house rose up before me as I turned into the drive, its Georgian facade graceful and imposing in the twilight. 42 rooms across 3 floors, with manicured gardens and a small orchard. Richard had bought it 35 years ago, when Hartwell Industries first became truly profitable. He'd raised his children here during his first marriage. And then, after the divorce, after the lonely years, he'd brought me here, and we'd made it ours. We'd redecorated. New paint, new furniture, new memories. The library we'd designed together, floor-to-ceiling shelves holding our combined book collection. The conservatory we'd added, where I spent mornings with coffee and newspapers. The master bedroom we'd completely renovated, creating a sanctuary that had nothing to do with his first wife and everything to do with us. For 15 years, this had been my home, our home. And if Vanessa, Marcus, and Trevor thought they were taking it tomorrow, they had another shock coming. I parked and walked inside, the familiar creak of the door a greeting. The house felt empty without Richard, but it didn't feel foreign. It felt like mine. Because it was mine. Every brick, every window, every inch of garden. They just didn't know it yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the chapel, about the performance Harrison had given, about the naked joy on their faces when they thought they'd inherited everything, about Vanessa calling me poor thing in a tone that dripped with false sympathy and real contempt. I'd known them for 15 years, had tried in the early days to build relationships, but they'd made clear from the first family dinner that I wasn't welcome, wasn't one of them, wasn't anything but an inconvenient woman who'd somehow bewitched their father. Never mind that Richard had been divorced from their mother for 8 years before he met me. Never mind that their mother had actually left him, had run off with her tennis instructor in a cliché so perfect it would have been funny if it hadn't devastated Richard. Never mind that Richard and I had met at a charity fundraiser, had spent 3 hours in conversation before he'd even asked my name, had dated for 2 years before marrying. To Vanessa, Marcus, and Trevor, I was the interloper, the gold digger, the second wife who'd stolen their inheritance. The irony was that I'd never wanted Richard's money. I'd had my own career before we married. I'd run a small but successful art gallery in the city, had my own investments, my own retirement accounts. I wasn't wealthy by Richard's standards, but I'd been comfortable, independent. I'd married him because he was brilliant and kind and made me laugh, because our conversations ranged from philosophy to politics to the best way to grow tomatoes, because he read poetry aloud on Sunday mornings and cried at opera and built birdhouses for the garden. I'd married him because I loved him, but they'd never believed that. Not once. Not even as the years passed, and Richard and I built a life that was obviously, visibly happy. At 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep and went down to the library. Richard's reading chair still sat by the window, his biography of Churchill still on the side table where I'd left it, unable to move it. I settled into my chair, the matching one he'd bought so we could read together, and let the familiar space comfort me. We'd spent thousands of hours in this room. Richard working on business plans while I handled gallery paperwork. Both of us reading, occasionally sharing interesting passages aloud. Listening to classical music on the vintage record player Richard had restored himself. On the wall hung a piece Richard had bought me for our 5th anniversary, an original watercolor by a local artist depicting the Cape House at sunrise. I'd mentioned once that I loved that particular view, and 3 weeks later, Richard had commissioned the painting. Every day should start with beauty, he'd said when he presented it. Like our marriage. God, I missed him. Missed his presence, his voice, his habit of bringing me coffee in bed every Saturday morning. Missed the way he'd hold my hand while we watched television. The way he'd kiss my forehead when he left for the office. The way he'd defend me to his children with quiet steel when they overstepped. They'll come around, he used to say. Eventually, they'll see what I see. But they never had, and now they never would. The clock struck 3. In 6 hours, the probate hearing would begin. Judge Blackwood would review the documents, Harrison would submit the motion, and the truth would emerge like sunrise, inevitable and absolute. I thought about calling someone, a friend perhaps, or my sister who lived 2 states away. But what would I say? That I was about to drop a legal bomb on my stepchildren? That I was about to prove definitively that their father had chosen me over them? It felt wrong to celebrate. Even though I was angry, even though they'd earned this, Richard was still gone. I'd still lost the love of my life. The justice I was about to receive felt hollow in the face of that emptiness. But it was justice Richard had wanted, had planned for, had insisted upon. Honoring that plan was honoring him. I must have dozed off in the chair because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the library windows and my phone was ringing. Harrison's name flashed on the screen. "Eleanor," he said when I answered. "Just wanted to confirm you're coming to the hearing." "I'll be there." "Good. It starts at 9, but Judge Blackwood wants to see us both in his chambers at 8:30. He wants to review the circumstances before the official proceeding." "The circumstances," I repeated, some bitter amusement creeping into my tone. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Eleanor, are you all right?" Was I? I didn't know anymore. My husband was dead. His children hated me. In a few hours, that hatred would crystallize into something permanent and irreversible. Even if they'd been capable of changing, of seeing me clearly, this would end any possibility of that. "I'm fine," I said, the automatic response. "Richard was certain this was the right approach," Harrison said gently, as if reading my thoughts. "He believed they needed to face consequences, real consequences, for the way they'd treated you. Treated him, frankly, in those last months." That was true. The way they'd circled him during his illness had been grotesque. Vanessa calling every day, suddenly interested in his health, his comfort, his estate planning. Marcus showing up with investment advisors, suggesting Richard move assets around for tax purposes. Trevor, who'd barely spoken to his father in years, suddenly needing money for various crises that sounded increasingly manufactured. Richard had seen through all of it, had been hurt by it, deeply, though he'd tried to hide that from me. "They're my children," he'd said one night, after a particularly grasping visit from Marcus. "I keep hoping they'll surprise me." "And if they don't," I'd asked, "then I'll make sure they learn that love isn't a transaction, and neither is inheritance." I showered, dressed in a simple navy suit, and drove to the courthouse. It was a beautiful building, all marble and brass, built in the 1920s when civic architecture still aspired to grandeur. Richard had always loved this courthouse, had served jury duty here twice, despite being wealthy enough to easily excuse himself. "It's our civic duty," he'd insisted. "Democracy only works if everyone participates." Harrison was waiting on the steps, his expression professionally neutral. Together, we walked through the metal detectors, through the echoing halls, to Judge Blackwood's chambers. The judge was in his early 70s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years of careful thought. He'd known Richard well. They'd served together on various boards and committees over the years. He gestured us to seats and closed the door. "Eleanor," he said warmly, "I'm so very sorry for your loss. Richard was one of the finest men I've ever known." "Thank you, Judge." "I've reviewed both documents," he continued, his tone shifting to business. "The will Harrison read yesterday, and the actual will currently filed with this court. I have to say, in 30 years on the bench, I've never seen anything quite like this situation." "Richard was theatrical sometimes," I said. Judge Blackwood smiled slightly. "That's one word for it. The man plotted this out like a military campaign. Harrison, walk me through the legal structure one more time." Harrison opened his portfolio. The core of Richard's estate plan dates to his marriage to Eleanor 15 years ago. At that time, he established an irrevocable clause. Any substantive changes to the will's primary beneficiaries would require both his signature and Eleanor's. The provision was designed to protect Eleanor from exactly the kind of pressure Richard suspected his children might exert. "And he never mentioned this to them," the judge said. "Never. They knew he'd updated his will when he remarried, but they assumed it was standard, providing for the new spouse but keeping the bulk for the children. They had no idea about the override clause." So, when Richard executed the will in March, during his hospitalization, he was creating a test, I said quietly, to see if they'd changed, if they'd matured, if they'd show me any compassion or respect when they thought they held all the power. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying me. "And did they pass?" I thought about Vanessa's poor thing, Marcus offering me the guest cottage like it was a generous gesture, Trevor already calculating how to access the accounts. "No," I said simply. "They failed spectacularly." "The March will was never legally binding," Harrison continued. "It couldn't be without Eleanor's co-signature, but Richard specifically instructed me to present it as valid at the funeral, to give his children one final opportunity to reveal their true characters in a public setting." "With witnesses," Judge Blackwood added. "I assume that's where this gets interesting?" Harrison pulled out a small digital recorder. "Richard asked me to document everything said after I read the March will. I have the entire conversation. Every word about the guest cottage, every calculation about accessing his accounts, every moment of celebration over inheriting everything while excluding Eleanor." The judge's expression darkened. "They celebrated? At his funeral?" "Hugged each other in front of the casket," I confirmed. "Called it a jackpot." For a long moment, Judge Blackwood sat in silence. Then he shook his head slowly. "I knew those children as kids. Richard used to bring them to courthouse events sometimes. I'd hoped they'd turned out better." "So did he," I said. "All right." The judge pulled the court documents toward him. "Here's how this is going to proceed. At 9 o'clock, we'll convene the probate hearing. The interested parties, that's you, Eleanor, and Richard's 3 children, will be present along with counsel. I'll review the March will that was read at the funeral. I'll then note the filing dates and see that the original will, properly executed and containing the override clause, predates it and remains the legal document of record. And then? I asked. Then I'll invalidate the March will and rule that the original stands. I'll review its provisions publicly, and I'll answer any questions, though I don't imagine there will be much to question. Richard's intent is crystal clear. My hands were shaking slightly. I pressed them together, willing steadiness. What are the original will's provisions? Harrison and Judge Blackwood exchanged glances. Harrison spoke. Eleanor, Richard left you everything. The house, the investments, the business, the art, the Cape property, all of it, with full control and no restrictions. I'd known this, of course. Richard and I had discussed it. But hearing it stated so baldly, knowing that in less than an hour, Vanessa, Marcus, and Trevor would learn it too, made the reality sharp and immediate. And his children? Each receives a trust fund of $100,000, Harrison said. Not insignificant, but nowhere close to the full estate value, which exceeds $40 million. $40 million. I'd never quite processed that number, even after 15 years of marriage. Richard had been wealthy in a quiet, understated way. We lived comfortably, but not ostentatiously. He drove a nice but not flashy car, wore expensive but conservative suits, donated generously to causes he believed in. The trusts come with conditions, Harrison continued. Each child must complete 200 hours of community service within 1 year. They must also write Eleanor a letter of apology, a genuine one, the contents to be evaluated by a panel of 3 independent assessors Richard appointed. If they complete these requirements, they get the full $100,000. If not, it goes to charity. He's making them work for forgiveness, I said. He's teaching them a final lesson, Judge Blackwood corrected gently. Whether they learn it is up to them. At 9 o'clock precisely, we entered the courtroom. It was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and solemn, with uncomfortable-looking benches for spectators. Vanessa, Marcus, and Trevor sat on one side with their lawyer, an expensive-looking man named Whitmore that Marcus must have hired yesterday. They all turned as I entered with Harrison. Vanessa's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the flicker of irritation in her eyes. She was dressed in a black sheath dress and pearls, like she was attending a society luncheon rather than a legal proceeding. Marcus wore a suit that probably cost $3,000, his jaw tight with impatience. Trevor looked hungover and resentful, slumped in his seat with his arms crossed. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, and we stood as Judge Blackwood entered in his black robes and took the bench. "Please be seated. This is the probate hearing for the estate of Richard Jonathan Hartwell, deceased. Present are the beneficiaries and interested parties. Let the record show that Eleanor Hartwell, widow of the deceased, is represented by Harrison Webb. Vanessa Hartwell Morrison, Marcus Hartwell, and Trevor Hartwell, children of the deceased, are represented by Charles Whitmore." Whitmore stood. "Your Honor, my clients are eager to move forward with the probate process expeditiously. The will was clearly read by Mr. Webb at yesterday's funeral service. We see no reason for delays." "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore," Judge Blackwood said mildly. "There are some matters to clarify first." Something in his tone made Marcus sit up straighter. Vanessa's carefully neutral expression flickered with confusion. Judge Blackwood held up 2 documents. "Mr. Webb, you read a will dated March 15th of this year at the funeral service yesterday. Is that correct?" "That is correct, Your Honor," Harrison said, standing. "And that will left the entirety of Richard Hartwell's estate to his 3 children, with a vague provision requesting they care for his widow?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And this document," he raised the other paper, "dated 15 years ago and updated periodically, but most recently, 8 months ago, was filed with this court as Richard Hartwell's official will. Is that also correct?" "It is, Your Honor." Vanessa leaned forward, whispering urgently to Whitmore. The lawyer looked confused, shuffling through papers. "Your Honor," Whitmore said, standing again, "I'm not sure I understand. Are there 2 wills?" "There are 2 documents," Judge Blackwood clarified. "Only one is legally valid. Mr. Webb, please explain the discrepancy." Harrison stood, and I watched his face settle into professional detachment. "Your Honor, Richard Hartwell did execute a will in March of this year while hospitalized. However, that will is invalid due to a provision in his estate plan established at the time of his marriage to Eleanor Hartwell." "What provision?" Marcus said, not bothering to stand, his voice sharp. Judge Blackwood didn't reprimand him for speaking out of turn. Instead, he looked directly at Richard's children. "The provision states that any changes to the primary distribution of Richard's estate require the signatures of both Richard and Eleanor Hartwell. The march will bears only Richard's signature. Therefore, it is legally void." The courtroom went very, very still. "That's not possible," Vanessa said, her voice rising slightly. "Harrison read the will. Dad left everything to us. We heard it. Everyone heard it." "You heard Mr. Webb read that document, yes," the judge agreed. "But hearing something read doesn't make it legally enforceable." Marcus stood, his face reddening. "This is ridiculous. Why would Harrison read a will that wasn't valid?" "Because," Harrison said quietly, "Richard asked me to." "What?" Trevor lurched forward. "You're saying Dad wanted you to read a fake will at his funeral? That doesn't make any sense." "It makes perfect sense," Judge Blackwood said, and there was no warmth in his voice now, none of the gentle sympathy he'd shown in Chambers. Richard wanted to see how his children would behave when they believed they'd inherited everything. He wanted to know if they'd show compassion and generosity to his widow, or if they'd immediately begin calculating their windfall and planning how to minimize their obligations to her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa's face had gone white. Marcus stood frozen, his expression transitioning from confusion to dawning horror. Trevor looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route. "Your Honor," Whitmore said, his professional composure cracking slightly, "I need to consult with my clients. This is highly irregular." "This is perfectly legal," Judge Blackwood interrupted. "Unorthodox, perhaps, but legal." Richard Hartwell had every right to test his children's characters. He had every right to structure his estate plan with protective provisions, and he had every right to ask his attorney to present a document knowing it would be superseded by the actual will. He leaned forward, and his gaze moved across Vanessa, Marcus, and Trevor like a spotlight exposing things that lived in darkness. "Now, let me read Richard's actual will, the one that matters, the one that governs the disposition of his estate." He began reading, his voice clear and authoritative. Each word landed like a hammer blow. "The house, to Eleanor Hartwell, in perpetuity, to be hers alone without restriction. The Cape property, to Eleanor Hartwell, with the same unrestricted ownership. The investment portfolio, to Eleanor Hartwell to manage or spend as she sees fit. The controlling shares of Hartwell Industries, to Eleanor Hartwell, along with the authority to determine the company's future direction. The art collection, the vehicles, the personal effects, Eleanor Hartwell. Everything. Every single thing. Mine. And then the trusts for the me children. $100,000 each, contingent on community service and letters of apology." When Judge Blackwood finished reading, the courtroom felt like it was vibrating with shock and rage. Marcus was the first to explode. "This is insane. He can't do this. That woman manipulated him, poisoned him against his own children. Sit down and be quiet, Mr. Hartwell," Judge Blackwood snapped, his gaze hardening into something that could cut glass. "You will not disparage Eleanor Hartwell in my courtroom. Your father made these decisions while of sound mind, with legal counsel, and with 15 years of observing exactly the kind of behavior you're displaying right now." "She's a gold digger!" Vanessa shouted, standing. Tears were streaming down her face, but they looked more like rage than grief. "She married him for his money! Everyone knows it!" "If she married him for money," Harrison said coldly, She picked a strange strategy, spending 15 years in a loving marriage, caring for him through his illness, building a life with him based on partnership and mutual respect. Gold diggers generally work faster than that. Your Honor, Whitmore tried again, my clients wish to contest this will. There are grounds: undue influence, lack of capacity. There are no grounds, Judge Blackwood said flatly. I knew Richard Hartwell for 20 years. I saw him regularly until 2 weeks before his death. He was sharp as ever, clear in his intent, and absolutely certain about these provisions. Moreover, the will was executed 8 months ago, long before his final illness. Any claim of diminished capacity is baseless. Then we'll fight the provision, Marcus snarled. That clause requiring Eleanor's signature will challenge its validity. You can try, Harrison said. You'll lose. The clause was reviewed by 3 separate law firms and deemed airtight. Richard spent considerable money ensuring you couldn't break it. Trevor was shaking his head, his face pale. Why? Why would he do this? We're his children. His actual children, not some woman he married when he was lonely. Enough. Judge Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip. You want to know why? Because yesterday, at your father's funeral, before his body was even cold, you celebrated your inheritance like you'd won the lottery. Because you offered his widow a guest cottage on property you believed you owned as if you were doing her a favor. Because in all your years as adults, you treated your father like a bank and his wife like an interloper. Richard Hartwell left his estate to Eleanor because she loved him and he loved her, and that's what people who love each other do. He let that sit for a moment, then continued in a slightly softer tone. The trust funds are available to you if you meet the stated conditions. 200 hours of community service and a genuine letter of apology to Eleanor. Those requirements are designed to teach you something your father clearly felt you never learned: empathy, humility, and respect. Whether you choose to learn that lesson is entirely up to you. Vanessa made a choking sound. She turned to look at me, and the hatred in her eyes was so pure, so distilled, that it actually made me flinch. You planned this, she hissed. You and Dad. You orchestrated this whole humiliation. Your father planned it, I said quietly. I just agreed to let it happen. Why? Her voice broke. Why did you need to humiliate us? Wasn't stealing our inheritance enough? I stood slowly, feeling every one of my 67 years, feeling the weight of 15 years of their dismissal and contempt, feeling Richard's absence like an open wound. I didn't steal anything, Vanessa. Richard wasn't your property. His money wasn't your birthright, and your inheritance was whatever he chose to leave you, which he had every legal and moral right to decide. We're his children, and I was his wife, his partner, his companion through the best years of his life. We built something together, something real and valuable, and he chose to leave that to me, to protect, to continue, to honor. By cutting us out, Marcus said bitterly, by giving you exactly what you earned. My voice was steady, but steel ran through it now. For 15 years, you treated me like an intruder. You questioned my motives, dismissed my opinions, excluded me from family events. When your father was sick, you circled him like vultures, already calculating your shares. And yesterday, at his funeral, you hugged each other over your good fortune while his body was 5 feet away. That's not... Vanessa started, but I kept going. Richard saw all of it. Every dismissive comment, every calculated visit, every time you treated him like a resource instead of a father. And it broke his heart. But he hoped, right up until the end, that you might surprise him, that you might show me some kindness, some compassion, when you thought you held all the power. He gave you one final chance to be the children he'd tried to raise you to be. And we failed, Trevor said hollowly. He was staring at his hands, his face ashen. We failed his test. You did, I agreed, spectacularly. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat. The will is valid and will be executed as written. Mrs. Hartwell, You'll need to work with Mr. Webb on the administrative details, transferring titles, updating accounts, all the usual probate procedures. That process will take several months. I understand, Your Honor. Vanessa, Marcus, Trevor Hartwell, the trust funds will be held by Harrison Webb as executor. If you wish to meet the conditions and claim them, you have 1 year from today. If not, the funds will be donated to charity per your father's instructions. Is that clear? None of them answered. Marcus was staring at me with naked loathing. Vanessa was crying openly now, her perfect makeup streaking down her face. Trevor looked like he might be sick. Is that clear? The judge repeated, his voice harder. Yes, Marcus finally ground out. Clear. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel struck, and it was over. They left without speaking to me. Vanessa practically ran from the courtroom, Marcus storming after her with Whitmore trailing behind trying to say something about appeals. Trevor hesitated at the door, turned back like he might say something, then thought better of it, and left. I stood there with Harrison in the empty courtroom, my legs suddenly unsteady. Harrison took my elbow gently. Come on, he said. Let's get you home. Home. The word felt different now. Not just a place Richard and I had shared, but truly, legally, irrevocably mine. We walked out through the marble halls, past the other courtrooms where other families were fighting other battles over money and property, and the complicated legacies of love and blood. Outside, the morning had turned bright and warm, the kind of October day Richard loved best. Harrison walked me to my car. You know they'll hate you forever now, he said quietly. I know. And they'll tell everyone who'll listen that you manipulated their father, stole their inheritance, destroyed their family. I know that too. So why do it? Why not just let me read the real will at the funeral? Why put yourself through yesterday's performance? I thought about that, about Richard's request that we do it this way, about his certainty that I'd agree, that I'd be strong enough to sit through their celebration and their casual cruelty. Because Richard needed me to see them clearly, I said finally, without any illusions, without any hope that they might change. He needed me to understand exactly who they are, so I wouldn't spend the rest of my life wondering if I'd misjudged them, if maybe they'd deserved more. He was protecting me from my own doubts. Harrison considered that, then nodded slowly. He was a clever man. The cleverest I ever knew. I drove home, to my home, and let myself in through the front door. The house felt different now, more settled somehow, more definitively mine. I walked through the rooms Richard and I had shared, touching familiar objects, remembering conversations and laughter, and quiet, companionable silence. In the library, I poured myself a glass of Richard's favorite scotch and settled into my reading chair. On the side table, I noticed an envelope I hadn't seen before, cream-colored paper with my name in Richard's distinctive handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then everything has gone according to plan. Harrison has performed magnificently. The children have shown their true selves, and you're sitting in our library wondering if we did the right thing. We did. I know you, my love. I know your generous heart, your tendency to see the best in people, your desire to heal rifts and build bridges. And I know that without yesterday's demonstration, you would have spent years wondering if perhaps you'd been too harsh, if maybe Vanessa, Marcus, and Trevor deserved more consideration, more of my estate, more of the legacy we built together. So I arranged for them to show you, definitively and publicly, exactly who they've chosen to be. Not who I hoped they'd be, not who they might have been with different choices, but who they are right now, people who valued my wealth over my happiness, my assets over my wife, their inheritance over my memory. I'm sorry for the pain that knowledge causes you, but I'm not sorry for protecting you from them. Everything I'm leaving you, the house, the money, the business, it's not just assets, it's freedom. Freedom to live the rest of your life however you choose, without depending on anyone, without compromising, without accepting anyone's contempt or dismissal. You gave me 15 years of joy, Eleanor. Let me give you this in return. As for my children, the trust funds and their conditions aren't punishment. They're one final lesson, one last chance for growth. If they choose to learn it, wonderful. If not, at least I tried. I love you more than I can express in this letter. Thank you for every moment, every conversation, every morning coffee and evening wine, every book recommendation, and garden walk and thunderstorm watched from the porch. Thank you for seeing me, not my money or my position, but me. That's a gift beyond price. Live well, my darling. Live freely. And remember me when the light turns golden in the evening. Forever yours, Richard. I sat in the gathering dusk with tears streaming down my face, Richard's letter pressed against my heart. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and whispers. Outside, the gardens were beginning their autumn dormancy, the leaves turning copper and gold. In the end, this was what mattered. Not the $40 million, not the house or the business or the legal victory. But this, Richard's understanding, his protection, his enduring love reaching across death to hold me one more time. The weeks that followed were strange and busy in equal measure. Harrison guided me through the administrative labyrinth of probate, signing documents, transferring titles, meeting with financial advisors and accountants. The business required attention. I spent days with the management team at Hartwell Industries, learning operations I'd only understood abstractly before. Richard's colleagues were kind, offering support and expertise. Some were surprised to learn I'd inherited controlling interest. Richard had been private about his estate planning, but none questioned my right or my capability. Richard had trained his executive team well. The company ran smoothly with or without daily involvement from the owner. Richard always said you had better business instincts than he did, the CFO told me during one meeting. He ran major decisions past you constantly. We knew you were his sounding board. I hadn't realized other people had noticed that, but it was true. Richard and I had discussed strategy, ethics, personnel decisions. He'd valued my perspective, had often changed course based on my feedback. I'd been part of Hartwell Industries all along, just not publicly. Vanessa, Marcus, and Trevor were invisible during this time. No calls, no emails, no attempts at reconciliation or conversation. Harrison heard through the legal grapevine that they'd consulted multiple attorneys about contesting the will and been told the same thing each time. No grounds, no chance, no point. The recording of their conversation after the funeral reading had become something of a dark legend in local legal circles. Harrison had played it for me once in his office, his face carefully neutral. Listening to them celebrate, calculate, plan their lives with Richard's money, it had hurt less than I'd expected. Mostly it just felt sad, like watching people fail a test they didn't know they were taking. 6 weeks after the funeral, I received an email from Trevor. The subject line was, "I'm sorry. Eleanor, I don't know if you'll read this. I wouldn't blame you if you deleted it without opening, but I wanted to try anyway. I've been thinking a lot about the funeral, about what Dad did, about why he did it." At first I was just angry. I thought it was cruel the way he manipulated us, the way you both humiliated us in front of everyone. But then I listened to the recording Harrison sent, the one from after the will reading, and I heard myself, heard what I said, how I sounded, and I was ashamed. Dad was dead, actually dead, and I was laughing, planning, calculating, like his death was winning the lottery. I don't know when I became that person. Maybe I always was and just never noticed. But Dad noticed, and he tried to teach me something even at the very end. I'm starting the community service this week, Habitat for Humanity. I figured building houses for people who need them might help me understand what Dad was trying to show me about work, value, real wealth. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to learn the lesson. Better late than never, I guess. Trevor. I read it 3 times looking for manipulation or angles or hidden resentment, but it sounded genuine, young and uncertain and genuine. I didn't respond right away, needed time to think about what, if anything, I wanted to say. But I saved the email in a folder marked, "Maybe." Vanessa and Marcus sent nothing. Harrison reported that Vanessa had hired a publicist and was giving interviews to society magazines about her stolen inheritance and her father's tragic susceptibility to younger women. The articles painted me as a calculating seductress who'd poisoned Richard against his loving children. "We could sue for defamation," Harrison suggested. "You'd win easily." "No," I said. "Let her have her narrative. The people who matter know the truth." Marcus, meanwhile, had started his own company, some kind of investment consulting firm with a website featuring his name and a photo of him looking competent in front of bookshelves he probably didn't own. He was trading on the Hartwell name, positioning himself as heir to his father's business acumen despite never having successfully run anything in his life. "That'll end badly," Harrison predicted. "Marcus doesn't have Richard's discipline or ethics. Give him 2 years before someone sues him or he runs out of money." "That's his lesson to learn," I said. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, snow was already falling, blanketing the gardens in white silence. I spent my days reading in the library, managing the business via phone and email, taking walks through the quiet neighborhood where Richard and I had strolled so many Sunday mornings. I wasn't lonely exactly, but I was alone in a way I'd never been during our marriage. Friends called, invited me to dinners and events. I went sometimes, appreciating the effort even when I didn't quite feel like socializing. People were kind, careful, asking about my grief with gentle concern. But no one asked about the will, about Vanessa and Marcus and Trevor. That was probably wise. It wasn't polite conversation. The holidays approached with their inevitable weight. Thanksgiving had always been complicated. Richard's children rarely attended our dinners, preferring to spend holidays with their mother or in-laws. But Christmas had been our time, just the two of us, reading by the fire and listening to Handel's Messiah while snow fell outside. I didn't know how to face Christmas alone. On December 15th, another email arrived from Trevor. "Eleanor, I finished the community service. It took me 3 months instead of the 3 or 4 it should have taken because I kept thinking about why I was doing it, what it meant. I didn't want to just go through the motions. I wanted to actually understand. I built parts of 3 houses, met families who'd lost everything in fires or floods or just bad luck, met volunteers who spend every Saturday helping strangers because they believe people should help each other, met a woman about your age who told me she'd been homeless once, and now she volunteers to make sure others don't go through what she went through." She asked me why I was there. I told her about Dad, about the will, about the conditions. And she said something I can't stop thinking about. "Sounds like your dad gave you a gift." A gift. The thing I thought was punishment was actually a gift. The chance to learn, to grow, to become someone better than I was. I wrote the letter of apology. The real one, not some performative nonsense to get the money. I don't know if you'll ever read it. Harrison has it with the other materials. But I meant every word. I'm not asking for anything. Just wanted you to know that Dad's lesson worked. On me, at least. I hope you're doing okay. I hope the house feels like home, and I hope someday, maybe, we can talk. Trevor. This time I responded, "Trevor, thank you for your email. Your words mean more than you probably realize. Your father loved you very much, all 3 of you. What he did wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about hoping that someday you'd grow into the people he knew you could be. I'm glad you're finding that path. It takes courage to look honestly at yourself and decide to change. Your father would be proud. When you're ready, if you want to talk, I'm willing to listen. Eleanor." On Christmas Eve, I sat in the library with a glass of wine and Handel playing softly. Snow was falling outside, fat flakes drifting past the windows. I'd hung a small wreath on the front door and put up a modest tree in the living room, not because I felt festive, but because Richard had loved Christmas trees, and it felt wrong not to have one. The doorbell rang, startling me. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find Trevor standing on the porch, snow dusting his hair and shoulders. He looked nervous, uncertain, younger than his 35 years. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I should have called. I was driving around, thinking about Dad, and I ended up here. I can go." "Come in," I said, stepping back. "You'll freeze out there." He came inside hesitantly, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. I took his coat, led him to the library, poured him a glass of wine. We sat in the matching reading chairs Richard had bought, the ones where he and I had spent countless hours, and we talked, really talked, for the first time in 15 years. Trevor told me about his struggles, his failures, the way he'd always felt inadequate compared to his siblings, how he'd used his father's money as a crutch, never developing his own strength, how the funeral had been a wake-up call he hadn't known he needed. I was celebrating because I thought money would solve everything, he said quietly. Like if I just had enough of Dad's fortune, I wouldn't have to face the fact that I was 35 and had nothing of my own. No career, no skills, no sense of who I was without the Hartwell name. And now? I asked. Now I'm scared, but also hopeful. I'm taking classes, community college, starting over. Maybe I'll figure out what I'm actually good at instead of just assuming the money will carry me. We talked until midnight, until Christmas arrived with church bells chiming in the distance. When Trevor left, he hugged me, brief and awkward, but genuine. "Merry Christmas, Eleanor," he said, "and thank you for giving me a chance to be better." I stood on the porch watching him drive away, snow falling soft and silent around me. Inside, the house was warm and lit, waiting. I went back to the library, back to Richard's chair, and the ghost of his presence that lingered there. I raised my wine glass to the empty air. "Merry Christmas, my love," I whispered. "Your plan worked. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough." In the spring, Harrison called with news. Trevor had completed all the requirements and claimed his trust fund. He'd used it to pay for school and start a small business, something to do with woodworking and custom furniture. Vanessa and Marcus had done nothing. The 1-year deadline came and went with no community service, no letters, no attempts to meet the conditions. Their trust funds were donated to charity per Richard's instructions. "They're still telling anyone who'll listen that you stole their inheritance," Harrison reported. "Vanessa's particularly bitter. She tried to sue you last month. The lawyer told her she didn't have a case and refused to file. And Marcus? His company's already in trouble. SEC is investigating some of his practices. Nothing criminal yet, but questionable enough to scare off his clients." I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, just a distant sadness for the people they could have been if they'd made different choices. "Trevor's doing well, though," Harrison added. "His business is getting good word of mouth, and he came by my office last week to thank me for executing Richard's will the way we did. Said it saved his life." Maybe that's what justice looks like, I thought. Not everyone learning the lesson, but the ones capable of learning, getting their chance. Time passed the way it does after loss. Slowly at first, each day heavy and distinct, then faster, weeks and months blurring together. I learned to live alone in the big house, learned to be a widow, learned to carry Richard's memory without being crushed by it. I stayed involved with Hartwell Industries, attending quarterly meetings and major decisions. The company thrived under professional management, growing steadily, treating workers fairly, maintaining the ethical standards Richard had insisted upon. I traveled some, took the trip to Italy. Richard and I had always planned but never quite managed, walked through the Uffizi thinking about how he would have loved the paintings, stood in the Sistine Chapel, and felt his absence like a physical presence. Trevor visited occasionally. We had dinner together every few months, our relationship tentative but real. He brought pieces of furniture he'd made, a side table for the library, a jewelry box for my birthday. Each piece showed skill and care, the work of someone finding purpose in craft. He never asked for more than the trust fund had provided, never suggested he deserved a larger share of Richard's estate. The lesson had taken root. Vanessa and Marcus I never saw again. They were rumors, stories that reached me third hand. Vanessa's marriage apparently ended in expensive divorce. Marcus's company folded under investigation. They'd made their choices and lived with them. On the second anniversary of Richard's death, I stood in the library at sunset, watching the light turn golden the way he'd described in his letter. The house was quiet around me, filled with books and art and memories. I'd spent 2 years honoring Richard's final wishes, protecting what we'd built together, learning to stand alone without him. And I'd survived. More than survived. I'd lived. The doorbell rang. I opened it to find Trevor with a large wrapped package. "I made you something," he said, "for Dad's anniversary. I hope it's okay." I unwrapped it carefully. It was a wooden box, beautiful cherry wood with inlaid maple detailing. Inside were dividers, sections for letters, photographs, mementos. "For memories," Trevor explained. "I thought, all the letters and cards and things you and Dad shared over the years, you should have a place to keep them safe." I ran my fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the care in every joint and curve. "It's beautiful, Trevor. Thank you." "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on me, for showing me that Dad's love wasn't about money. It was about hoping I'd become someone worthy of loving." After he left, I carried the box to the library and began filling it. Letters from Richard, dating back to our courtship. Cards from anniversaries and birthdays. The note he'd left me explaining his will. Photographs of us together, smiling in gardens and on beaches, and in this room where we'd spent so many peaceful hours. At the bottom of my desk drawer, I found one more thing. The program from Richard's funeral, from that terrible day when everything had changed. I opened it and read the psalm that had been printed inside. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Richard had restored my soul when we married, had given me 15 years of partnership and joy. And even in death, he'd protected me, provided for me, ensured I could live the rest of my life with dignity and freedom. That was love. Not the grasping, calculating performance his children had offered, but real love, steady, thoughtful, enduring. I placed the funeral program in the memory box and closed it gently. Outside, the evening light turned amber and gold, painting the library in the colors Richard loved best. I poured a glass of wine, settled into my reading chair, and opened a book. The house settled around me, mine, earned not through manipulation or greed, but through years of genuine partnership, through love given and received freely, through the simple daily choice to see another person clearly and cherish them anyway. They'd called me poor thing at the funeral. But I wasn't poor. I was rich in ways they'd never understand. Rich in memories, in love received, in the freedom to live my remaining years however I chose. Rich in the knowledge that I'd been truly seen, truly known, truly cherished by a man whose judgment I trusted completely. Richard had left me everything, not just money and property, but the far more valuable gift of his absolute confidence that I was worthy of it all. And in the end, that was the inheritance that mattered. Not the $40 million, or the houses, or the business, but the knowledge that I'd been loved well and wisely by someone who knew me completely. I raised my glass to the golden light, to the memory of Richard reading in the chair across from mine, to the 15 years we'd shared and the life I was still living in their wake. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty room, to the lingering presence of love that doesn't end with death. "For everything." The light faded to twilight. I turned on a lamp, opened my book, and continued reading. Outside, the world moved on. Seasons changed. The garden Richard and I had planted together grew and bloomed and rested and grew again. And I lived. Freely, fully, exactly as Richard had hoped I would. That was his final gift, and I honored it every day.